prepares to start withdrawing troops from Lebanon in a few hours' time. A Syrian minister says the redeployment would be completed after 2 to 3 days. The British government says there'll be no more concessions on its controversial anti-terrorism legislation. The brutal rape case in Pakistan that's caused worldwide outrage. Now it goes back to the courts. And on a wing and a prayer, can Prince Charles help save the albatross from extinction? Hello, welcome to BBC News with me, Deborah Mackenzie. Syrian troops in Lebanon are due to start pulling back towards the Syrian border in a few hours' time. The pullback is to take place in 2 phases, and will begin after the Syrian president and his Lebanese counterpart have met in Damascus to discuss details. Lebanese opposition figures in Beirut have said it's essential that a full withdrawal take place before the country's legislative elections, which are due in May.
Syrian troops weren't budging today, but tomorrow the landscape in Lebanon could start to change. The country's defence minister says Syria will begin its withdrawal by bringing troops back to positions here in the Bekaa Valley, phase 1 of the pullout. And now Syria has to go. Will it be gone before Lebanon votes in May? We put that question to a leading minister.
We hope that it's going to be before the elections in May, not because the Americans are asking. We are hoping that it will be done as soon as it is logistically possible. I think the important point is that the political decision has been made and that steps will follow immediately to implement that decision.
A decision that is painful for some Syrians. It will be a humiliating retreat and the end of Syria's days as a regional power. In the ancient marketplace in the old city of Damascus, Abu Osama cursed the Lebanese. If that's what they want, he said, to hell with them. We did so much for them, and now they're insulting us. But this woman said the Lebanese were well able to run their own affairs, and pulling out was the best solution. Syria has been badly bruised by all this. The regime has learnt a hard lesson about clinging to the past. The hope here is that the international pressure will start to recede now that a pullout has been promised. But much will depend on exactly how fast the Syrians get moving. And Washington in particular probably won't rest until it sees Syrian troops hitting the road and making their way back home. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Damascus.
The British government has signalled that it won't make any more major concessions on its controversial new anti-terrorism measures. Ministers say a stark warning from the country's former top policeman about the scale of the terrorist threat to Britain highlights the need to push the new legislation through Parliament this week.
One of Sir John Stevens' last legacies before he left was to rubber-stamp tough security measures at Scotland Yard. Behind the scaffolding, massive new buffers to deter suicide bombers. Police and MI5 believe there are several hundred al-Qaeda sympathisers in the UK giving backup support, with a small number ready to plant a bomb. But today, Sir John warned up to 200 would commit devastating attacks if they could. He wrote in a Sunday paper, "I'm still shocked by new developments in the al-Qaeda threat. Some of the reports that crossed my desk in the last few months alone made my hair stand on end." His words have alarmed some in anti-terrorist circles, where they don't want to talk numbers for fear it gives too much information to the terrorists. Some aren't convinced by his figures.
I think it's a little over the top. I'd certainly never heard before a figure of 200 al-Qaeda terrorists bandied about. And it's interesting that we've got the figure, but without any backup substantiation of it.
Perhaps more controversially, Sir John has entered the debate over detainees held without charge in jails like Belmarsh. The law lords ruled jailing them breaches their human rights and they're due to be freed as early as Friday. That, claims Sir John, is madness, as he says they're dangerous. He says human rights are being too skewed toward the individual, this small group of evil individuals in particular. Sir John says new anti-terrorist laws must be pushed through, though he has reservations about house arrest as an alternative to jail. Today, the government urged opposition MPs to do just this and support their plans.
I don't think there's going to be any further compromise on our determination to protect people in this country from terrorism, and the other parties will now have to make their mind up.
The Lib Dems already have. Today they voted to continue opposing the new anti-terrorist laws because they give too much power to the government instead of judges.
We should certainly respect what senior policemen like Sir John say about the terror threat, but that doesn't mean to say you have to throw away hundreds of years of principles of justice.
The Tories also want judges, not ministers, deciding who's detained, fearing long-standing legal principles like the right to a fair trial are at stake. Tonight they still want concessions.
We've made two very fair offers to the Prime Minister: either continue the existing statutory powers to detain foreign suspects or put the new powers onto the statute book just until November, give people time to think about it carefully.
Some who are still at the sharp end of the fight against terrorism are slightly uncomfortable that Sir John's words could cause undue alarm. On the other hand, like him, they want as much power as they can get to track suspects, and they want the government to send a strong message of deterrence. One thing driving Sir John is the fear that whatever's done, one attack could get through. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News, Scotland Yard.
The Pakistani government has said it will file an appeal in the country's highest court against the acquittal of 5 men in a gang rape case, described as a brutal honour punishment. A court had originally sentenced the men to death, but that verdict was overturned by the High Court in Lahore. On Saturday, the survivor of the rape, Mukhtar Mai, said she feared for her safety.
The case has caused outrage around the world. The trial court found that a council of village elders had ordered Mukhtar Mai to be raped because her brother had allegedly had an affair with a woman from a higher caste tribe. But on Thursday, an appeal court ordered that 5 men sentenced to death for the crime should be released because of a lack of evidence. Mukhtar Mai says her life is now in danger. There's a threat to my life, the danger of harassment, not to me alone, but to my entire family, she explained. She denies the claims about her young brother, saying the story was made up to hide the truth, that he was sexually assaulted by men from the higher clan. The High Court decision has been greeted with disgust.
Human rights organizations and activists in Pakistan are stunned over the decision of the High Court and wonder about the meaning of justice in the country. Despite the wide coverage of the crime committed against her nationally and internationally, the recent verdict has shattered her confidence in the criminal justice system.
The school teacher has been planning an appeal, but now the government has acted. It is to go to the highest court in the land. Mukhtar Mai's relatives are far from alone in their anguish. Gang rapes and honour killings of women are common in feudal rural communities. The Human Rights Commission of Pakistan says around 1,000 women were victims in 2003, and the figures are rising slowly. Lisa Hamperley, BBC News.
Right, police in Turkey have used batons and used tear gas to break up what they say was an unauthorised demonstration ahead of International Women's Day. Police say they'd called on the protesters to disperse, but a group of around 100 refused.
The demonstration in Istanbul had begun quietly enough. Several hundred people had gathered ahead of International Women's Day on Tuesday. They chanted slogans denouncing government policies and demanding equal rights for women. But the rally quickly descended into violence. Police claim the demonstration was unauthorized, and when some of the protesters refused to disperse, force was required to make them leave. Tear gas was fired and truncheons used against those unlucky enough to be caught by the authorities. Several dozen people were arrested as they waited to join the demonstration. While many women in Turkey enjoy leading roles in political and social life, violence against women does still remain a serious problem in a country which hopes to begin accession talks with the European Union this year. Brady Barry, BBC News.
And still to come here on BBC News, an Israeli bank is investigated over allegedly laundering hundreds of millions of dollars. The latest exit poll in parliamentary elections in the former Soviet Republic of Moldova suggests that the governing communists have lost their parliamentary majority. Moldova's communists used to be pro-Russian, but now support closer ties to Europe. Our correspondent Helen Fawkes has been monitoring the day's events from the Moldovan capital.
The party, which turned its back on Moscow, looks set to be returned to power. But the pro-Western communists received less than half the vote, according to the exit poll. This suggests they will not have enough seats to elect the next president or pass laws on their own. The communist leader, President Vladimir Voronin, had pledged to continue Moldova's push towards European integration.
I have voted for Moldovan prosperity.
It was the opposition group, which wants closer ties to Russia, that did better than expected. Moscow has been accused of supporting this party during the election campaign. On the eve of the poll, 100 Russians claiming to be observers were arrested on their way to the capital. Officials said they were not registered and intended to cause trouble. Turnout was just over 60%, but there were queues outside many of the polling stations. And this wasn't the only complaint. Election observers and the opposition have claimed there were a number of violations. The pro-Western opposition party has said that the ballot was not free or fair. This party has said it may organise mass protests inspired by the success of the Orange Revolution in neighbouring Ukraine. Helen Fawkes, BBC News, Chisinau.
The Jordanian Foreign Minister Hani al-Mulki has been visiting Israel, the most senior Jordanian official to go there for 4 years. During meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and senior ministers, Mr. al-Mulki appealed for the intensification of efforts to solve conflicts involving Israel, the Palestinians, Lebanon and Syria. Both countries are reported to have agreed to cooperate on building a canal between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea in an effort to prevent further drying of the Dead Sea. Jewish settlers in the southern Gaza Strip have planted olive trees in a gesture to show their determination to stay on the land. The Israeli government plans to remove all 21 settlements from Gaza and 4 from the West Bank in the summer. The pull-out plan has been approved by both the Israeli cabinet and parliament, despite opposition from the settlers and their backers. And now the headlines here on BBC News. Syria is preparing to start withdrawing troops from Lebanon in the next few hours after weeks of international pressure. The British government has said it won't make any more major concessions on its controversial new terrorism legislation. Pakistan's government is set to file an appeal in the country's High Court over the acquittal of 5 men accused of gang rape. Well, back now to our top story, the withdrawal of Syrian troops from Lebanon. Aaron Miller has served as an advisor to 6 US Secretaries of State, helping to formulate US policy on the Middle East, and he joins us from our Washington studio. Aaron Miller, do you see what's happening in Lebanon as indicative of moves in the wider Arab world?
I do. In fact, I think something quite extraordinary is happening, although it's going to take quite a lot of time to play out. I think what's happening essentially is that forces unleashed from the Iraq War have combined with leadership changes, the passing of Yasser Arafat, the passing of Hafez Assad, with a real determination on the part of Arab publics to assert a capacity for change. All of these things are coming together in a quite remarkable fashion. You know, 2005 has already witnessed the 2 fairest and freest elections ever held in the Arab world, and they occurred quite paradoxically under American and Israeli military occupations in Iraq and in Palestine. And what that shows is the hunger and thirst for change on the part of Arab publics, but also the resistance to that change. So is this going to call for more dramatic regime changes, or will there be a more smooth transition? I think the problem is that the change is not likely to be revolutionary in character. You know, arguably there's only been one real revolution in that part of the world in the last half century, and that occurred in a non-Arab country, in Iran. I think change is likely to be more evolutionary, although I believe that it may not be orderly. You may well have to see a regime change in some of these countries in order to produce the kind of profound, meaningful and political reform that could lay the basis of real democracies. You know, individuals become democrats. Foreign powers cannot create democracy. What the United States has done, it seems to me, is level the playing field. It's removed an authoritarian structure in Iraq. But the real job will be up to Iraqis, Palestinians, hopefully Lebanese and Syrians, to build a kind of democratic institutions and assert the kind of leadership that produce long-term democracies.
And what happens if, instead of democracies, we have fundamentalist Muslims elected?
Well, the truth is, once these forces are unleashed, once people have the right to assert themselves at the poll, and presumably, if it's done peacefully, without extremism married to violence in the service of political change, those decisions have to be respected. Although I suspect that the kind of extremist radical sentiment likely to produce regimes that are radical in character, that's really quite out of step with what is happening elsewhere in the world. I think by and large you will see extremist movements within these societies, but in the main, if this evolutionary change works, it's going to produce governance, it seems to me, of a centrist character.
Aaron Miller, many thanks for joining us. The US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has again expressed regret over the shooting of an Italian Secret Service agent by American troops in Iraq. The man, Nicola Calipari, was killed when soldiers opened fire on a car carrying him and an Italian hostage he'd helped to free. The case has made a big emotional impact in Italy.
A solemn welcome for a fallen hero. Nicola Calipari's body arrives at the Vittoriano monument in Rome. Draped in the Italian flag, the coffin now lies in state. Hundreds queue for a last chance to pay their respects.
I already queued outside this building for the 19 Italians killed in Syria. We are now here to pay homage to this man because he had the courage to give his life without a thought for his family to save this woman.
And this is the newspaper everyone wants to read today. Freed hostage Giuliana Sgrena tells her story, the bravery of the intelligence officer who died to save her from American bullets. Tomorrow, Italy bows its head for a state funeral, but is still asking why. Tamsin Smith, BBC News, Rome.
Police have arrested 22 people working at one of Israel's biggest commercial banks over suspected money laundering. Detectives say it was one of the largest money laundering affairs in Israeli history, worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Police leave the Tel Aviv branch of Bank Hapoalim after gathering more evidence. Their year-long undercover investigation involves 80 bank accounts and 170 customers. According to police, the bank workers had helped customers move money without reporting the transfers, and that breaks Israel's money laundering laws. They said that funds had passed through the bank from a number of countries, including Russia and France.
This is an investigation of enormous proportions, financial and material, and there are a lot of people dealing with it.
Before introducing anti-money laundering legislation in the year 2000, Israel was considered a haven for money launderers and was on a US State Department blacklist. Officials say this latest investigation shows that Israel is serious about clamping down on the practice.
I think the message we delivered is stay away. If you're a criminal who wants to launder criminal money over here, you don't want to do it in Israel.
Bank Hapoalim is Israel's biggest. News of the investigation affected the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange as its shares fell by more than 2%. Richard Forrest, BBC News.
Some news just in now. The Bolivian President Carlos Mesa has announced that he'll present his resignation on Monday because of a crisis in the country. His government has faced mass protests in recent weeks with street demonstrations and road blockades throughout the country. We'll bring you more on that as we get it. Now, thousands of people in Chile have been paying their last respects to the veteran leader of the Communist Party there, Gladys Marin, who's died of cancer at the age of 63. She campaigned against the military government of General Augusto Pinochet, and in 1998 she filed the first lawsuit against him for human rights abuses.
Gladys Marin campaigned for years for a return to democracy in Chile. and for years afterwards to bring General Augusto Pinochet to justice. She was already a three-time congresswoman at the time of the American-backed coup of 1973, which forced her and many others to seek safety abroad. Her husband stayed behind. He was arrested and never seen again. Gladys Marin returned to Chile and led the underground opposition to military rule. Afterwards, she was often on the streets campaigning against the economic policies she argued weighed unfairly on the poor, and for justice for the crimes of the military regime. The centre-left government paid tribute to her.
We are sure that Chile will remember her as a fighter, an example, a woman who confronted tirelessly the rigours of the military regime, at great price to herself and her family.
Perhaps the high point of her campaign was the news of the arrest of Augusto Pinochet in London in 1998, but her joy was short-lived. He escaped extradition. Gladys Marin did not live to see Pinochet on trial, but the campaign she started continues. Her Communist Party was never powerful, and standing for the presidency, she never earned more than 5% of the vote. But Gladys Marin earned admiration not so much for the policies she stood for, but for her campaign for justice. Raphael Jezeram, BBC News.
In other news, the Deutsche Börse has withdrawn its offer for the London Stock Exchange. It's reported that the Frankfurt Stock Exchange's chief executive was forced to bow to mounting opposition to the deal from his own investors. In a statement, the Deutsche Börse said the decision was taken because the LSE did not recommend a price for shares that it could accept. Up to 20,000 Moroccans have joined a protest demanding the release of hundreds of prisoners of war held in Algeria. The demonstrators in the capital Rabat called for the return of the men captured by the Algerian-backed Polisario Front during the war for control of Western Sahara in 1975. Now, on the latest stop of a flying visit to New Zealand, the heir to the British throne, Prince Charles, has made an impassioned plea to save the albatross from extinction. At a conservation project in Dunedin, the Prince called their decline in numbers an appalling tragedy. Our royal correspondent Peter Hunt is travelling with him.
This is a sight which is becoming rarer. The royal albatross, one of the world's largest seabirds, is threatened with extinction because of modern fishing methods. It regularly travels around the globe. Prince Charles did just that to catch a glimpse. The albatross's would-be royal protector was given a traditional Maori welcome. Prince Charles spoke a few words of greeting in the native language.
Ina iwi katoa, tana koutou, tana koutou, tana koutou katoa.
Song is an important part of this ceremony, as is the hongi, New Zealand's future king rubbing noses with some of his future subjects. They share a concern about the endangered albatross. The prince said international action was needed because the clock was ticking fast.
Will it take the complete dodo-like disappearance of this noble winged creature to bring us to our senses? Or are we to remain blind and deaf to the appalling tragedy unfolding out of sight, out of mind?
This was a passionate speech by a passionate prince, anxious and determined to use his royal status to highlight the plight of the albatross. Coming here for the prince would have been the fulfilment of one of his lifetime's ambitions. Peter Hunt, BBC News, the Otago Peninsula, New Zealand.
Graham Madge from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds explained the scale of the problem facing the albatross.
Research by the RSPB and BirdLife International has shown that out of 21 of the world's species of albatross, 19 are considered to be globally threatened, and the main impact on those populations is longline fisheries. Every hour we're losing something like 11 albatrosses. 100,000 birds a year will die until we can get these organisations that manage the sea to honour their obligations.
What's happening then? Are they turning a blind eye?
There are 19 organisations around the world that are responsible for marine fisheries, and of those that occur within the range of albatrosses, only one is honouring its commitment, and sadly 4 in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic are doing precious little for the conservation of these birds.
Now, some might say, well, this is one species, we've done without the dodo. Why is it important for us to save at this
We're
point?
not just talking about the loss of one particular species. We're talking about breaking a whole branch from the evolutionary tree. These birds have been phenomenally important. They're a major part of the marine ecosystem, and of course they've been part of our culture for many years as a seafaring nation. And I think that His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales is right to identify the threat that is posed to these birds, because if we don't act now, then within a few years we could start to see the loss of these species completely from the planet, and I think everybody would agree that that is a real travesty.
And other birds are under threat too, presumably?
Indeed. Well, we know that around 300,000 albatross relatives also die as a result of these fisheries, and of course the main thing is that it's not necessary. We know that there are measures that these boats can take, and that there are measures these organisations can take to try and stop this appalling slaughter. We just urge everybody involved, including the member governments of these commissions, to actually look and honour their responsibilities so that these magnificent birds have a future.
And that's all from the BBC Newsroom for the moment. Stay with us.
Hello there. Well, it looks like our cold snap's going to be easing off through the week ahead, feeling just a little bit more like spring. But across other parts of Europe, well, there's still quite a deep freeze going on. As you can see, central France saw temperatures holding no better than -3. Across Germany too, it's still particularly cold at the moment, and even down across the Mediterranean, temperatures are struggling, particularly in Mallorca and Menorca. Now, things will ease up a little bit, I think, through the week ahead. Slightly milder air, certainly feeding in across Spain and Portugal, moving up across France and Germany as well. But if anything, it's going to get colder across Eastern Europe. And pretty cold here tonight as well under clear skies. We've seen temperatures dropping as low as -4 or -5 across some clear areas across central and southern parts of England and Wales. The frost a bit more limited across northern Scotland because there's more in the way of cloud here, and it's going to be a cloudier picture generally, I think, during Monday. The clouds thick enough here and there to give some patchy showers, most of those quite light, but the odd heavier one might turn up through the course of the afternoon. And I think generally you'll find that trend to cloudy conditions as the day goes on after that bright but chilly start. But one or two places could well hang on to some reasonable sunny spells. Central Lowlands of Scotland, one likely spot, because with winds coming down from the north, the cloud will tend to break up over the mountains and hopefully leave rather sunnier skies for Glasgow and for Edinburgh. Across Northern Ireland, though, I think you'll find the opposite. The clouds tending to increase as the day goes on, and the odd sharp shower is certainly a possibility here from around about lunchtime onwards. Temperatures, well, nothing too impressive. 7 to 9 degrees typically, 9, possibly 10 degrees where you get some decent sunny spells coming through. Shouldn't feel too bad, but it will be quite chilly along those eastern coasts of England with a pretty brisk wind still coming in from the north. But still a decent afternoon for the racing, I think, at Hereford, Lingfield and Wolverhampton. Fine at all three venues, and it's going to stay fine through into Tuesday as well. By and large, there'll be the odd little bit of patchy rain here and there, maybe eastern parts of England, the likely spot to see some of that, but it won't amount to a great deal. And in between the showers, there'll be a little bit of sunshine from time to time as well. And it should stay fine, I think, in London, certainly for the big game, Chelsea taking on Barcelona through the evening, turning quite chilly though once again. Into the middle part of the week, it doesn't change a great deal. Still winds coming in from the north, bringing fairly cloudy skies for many of us. But once again, sheltered areas, southwest Scotland, for example, perhaps Cumbria as well, seeing a little bit more in the way of sunshine. And wherever the sun breaks through, then you are going to get those temperatures levelling out at around about 9 or 10 degrees. Latter part of the week, no great change. Still a fair amount of cloud around, still reasonably mild compared to recent days. We'll start to see a change though through towards the end of the week. Heavier outbreaks of rain coming in across northern Scotland. That heralds something of a change with colder winds set to follow on behind. So it looks like it could turn a little bit colder again by next weekend. Here's a summary.
China 今年将超过英国，成为世界第4大经济强国。
在中国，3亿多的孩子在学英语，他们是英国人口的5倍。
中国的纺织业占全球产量的20%，或许你现在身上穿的衣服就是那里制造的。
Isn't it time we got to know the world's fastest growing superpower? China Week, all this week across the BBC.
Within the last few
Breaking news coming from Israel. An explosion has rocked Tel Aviv.
In the last hour, a Muslim girl has won an appeal to wear her Islamic dress to school.
A mother has been found guilty of killing her son by poisoning him with salt while he was in hospital. Breaking news this afternoon is that soldiers have been found guilty on charges over the treatment of Iraqi prisoners in...
Whenever it happens here. BBC News 24.
And the main news. Syrian troops in Lebanon are due to start pulling back towards the Syrian border in a few hours' time. The pullback will begin after the Syrian president and his Lebanese counterpart have met in Damascus to discuss details. Lebanese opposition figures have said it's essential that a full withdrawal take place before the country's legislative elections in May. The British government says it won't make any more major concessions on its controversial new anti-terrorism measures. Ministers say a warning from the country's former top policeman about the scale of the terrorist threat to Britain highlights the need to push the legislation through Parliament this week. 3 people are due to appear at Bow Street's Magistrates Court today, charged with plotting to fund terrorism. The 2 men and a woman from Coventry were arrested on Tuesday. One of the accused also faces charges of directing a terrorist organisation and belonging to a proscribed organisation, Lashkar-e-Taiba, or Army of the Righteous. Detectives searching for a missing 34-year-old woman have found a body near the village of Langham in Norfolk. Kim Fuller vanished on Thursday after telling a relative she was going to visit friends in Soham in Cambridgeshire. But formal identification will not take place until later today. The 38-year-old man is being questioned at a police station in Cambridgeshire on suspicion of murder. The train drivers' union ASLEF has called for new safety measures to prevent accidents and collisions on the railway network. It says the technology is already being used in the United States. The union says it would be criminally irresponsible not to introduce the new equipment here. According to industry figures, 80 trains collide with obstacles on the line every day. Now, remember, you can keep up to date with all our top stories, our weather and sport through the interactive service BBC I. Press the red button and then follow the on-screen instructions. That's the news. Now on BBC News 24, it's time for Dateline London.
Hello, in Dateline London, our discussion this week, can Syria's President Assad deliver on what he seemed to say on withdrawing from Lebanon? Plus, will Sinn Féin restore its political credibility and deliver those who murdered a leading Republican? Well, joining me today on the programme, Baria Alamuddin, who is Lebanese and foreign editor of Al Hayat, Thomas Kielinger from Germany's Die Welt, Michael Goldfarb from the US radio station WBUR of Boston, and Michael White, political editor of The Guardian. Welcome to you all. So Syria's President Bashar al-Assad seems to have committed Syria to withdrawing its forces from Lebanon. But how many, which ones, to where and when? Under his all-powerful father, Damascus gave the same commitment 16 years ago as part of the 1989 Taif Agreement to end the civil war. Somehow, mainly because of its interest in creating a greater Syria in Lebanon, prevarication ruled and the withdrawal has never happened. But now unrelenting pressure from Saudi Arabia after the murder of its friend and former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri has changed dramatically the dynamics. And the massive bomb 3 weeks ago may have achieved exactly the opposite of what those who planted it intended. Baria Alamuddin, is the message from Damascus clear, unequivocal and unambiguous? Withdrawal from Lebanon?
Yes, I think it's clear. I wouldn't call it all the rest. It is clear. What it lacks is to say when. Is it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be after a week? Yet we have heard voices after Bashar al-Assad spoke, mainly from ministers and from sources in Lebanon, that it would be within the months. It would be before the summit, the Arab summit in Algiers.
A full withdrawal of every single member of the Syrian security forces in uniform or plain clothes?
Well, he didn't talk about the security forces, but presumably when you talk about forces, it includes the security forces.
Which is many more than 14,000.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's a couple, probably more thousand people. But the thing is, would the influence go? Because don't forget, with these people in Lebanon are many Lebanese working in concert with them. So the idea is not only the physical withdrawal of these people, but the actual influence day to day. And I think Bashar al-Assad gave an interesting pointer yesterday when he said, we still want to work with the Lebanese. And of course, the Lebanese want that. Syria and Lebanon have always had a very special relationship. And the Lebanese, the majority of the Lebanese, want this special relationship, but based on each country being totally independent from the other. What he said is that we want to deal with the Lebanese on cultural issues, social issues, educational issues. So that, I think, gives an implication that maybe he wants to move from the Mukhabarat era, from the intelligence era.
Now, France and particularly the United States have been giving a very public stand on this, saying you've got to leave. But where's the pressure really come from, given this meeting in Saudi Arabia?
Nick, anything happening in the Arab world these days, if you just mention that this is being done with pressure coming from the United States of America specifically, and I'm sorry here, you will be ruined. Anybody who says I'm doing this because it's pressure from America. This is coming mainly from, I think, two sources, mainly the Arab world, and I would say, yes, you're right about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has acted always like the father figure in the Arab world, and it always has acted, if you like, very logically. And of course, as you said, Rafiq al-Hariri was very close to them, but also nobody in the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia, wants any more trouble in the Arab world.
But in other words, it was a very tough meeting. It was a very tough meeting when the president went there to see the Crown Prince.
I'm sure it was a tough meeting.
And the message
very
was
frank, very on. And the message was get out because of internal pressure from the Arab world, from Lebanon, and also from the United States of America and the UN. So it's not only the United States. People are not in the Arab world, thinking this today that, wow, it's, George Bush has been re-elected and all of a sudden democracy is going to come because it's been imported. This is cannot be true. Democracy is either born within you and coming from within you and within the culture of that community. Otherwise, nobody can import it or give it.
Thomas, it's a very complicated situation in Lebanon and the whole Levant area. But what's your reading? Do you think we believe the younger President Assad here?
I think we do, because all these individual figures, and Assad in this case, is part and parcel of an environment of thinking, of new thinking that is going on around him. And I would be careful not to let my hope and optimism run amok, as it were. We've been disabused and disappointed too many times about supposedly positive signs. But there is something afoot. There is something going on in the Arab world. And Assad would look rather awkward if he didn't sort of join the bandwagon as best he can.
But is he taking a big risk, though, Baria? I mean, particularly with his, I mean, he after all is young. He's not one of these old Baathists sitting in Damascus.
Yes, with his constituency. This is why I think at the beginning when he was speaking mainly to the people in Damascus, in Syria, before speaking to anybody else, because he had to secure his own grounds. And something else, he did say that more steps will be taken, I think, internally. And I think we will be probably seeing more democratization steps happening in Syria soon.
Can I ask through Nick Barry a
you
question?
ask it yourself.
Yes,
David Hurst, my Guardian colleague, written from the Middle East for 40 years, said in the paper on Saturday, if the Syrians go, then the country will start to break up again. It'll be maybe second Iraq. Factions will come back back to the civil war. Now, is there any truth in that?
No, I think David is a very respectable writer, and I read his pieces religiously. But I think I would disagree with him here.
Okay.
The situation has totally changed. Before, I'm not saying it's not vulnerable. I'm not saying that the society is not vulnerable at large because of these old factions. But I think there's a new mood. There is a new generation in Lebanon. We've suffered from the war. So I think the coming together, and this is what we have seen in the streets of Beirut, of people from all walks of life, rich, poor, Christian, Muslim, all sects of Christianity, all sects of Muslims, being in the streets.
We hear Western commentators talk all the time about the Arab street. Is this the voice of the Arab street in all these countries?
Lebanon has always been the voice of the Arab street, Michael. Allow me to say, I a student in university and otherwise, have always demonstrated. I spend more time in demonstrations than in classes.
Should you be saying this?
Well, why not? Why not? Yes, indeed. Yes.
Clearly, class is overrated.
Yeah. No, but historically speaking, Lebanon has always enjoyed democracy.
The thing is that You can't overdo the generalizations either about Arab Street. The Lebanese Street. Lebanon is a very particular country.
I agree. I totally agree. But I think one should take the problem of Lebanon within the context of the region. Don't forget what's happening in Iraq, in Palestine. So the whole region, the situation is far from being stable.
But you talk about democracy, and Hezbollah, after all, have several seats in the parliament in Beirut. But is it at the moment Syrian-skewed democracy? In other words, Syria still has a heavy hand on it.
I think the elections themselves are fair and transparent. It's who is entering the elections which has been more or less, if you like, implied that Syria is the one choosing who runs for these elections, which in some cases I believe is true. Nevertheless, the new elections in May, which are not very far, are coming, and I think we're going to see a new landscape as far as these elections are concerned.
It's not going to be May the 5th, is it? We're not going to have it on the same day.
No, I promise you it's going to be 22nd.
But Maria, I would widen the impact of what we see in the streets. It's not just the Arab world. We've seen something of an orange revolution in Kiev the other day. I mean, we live in a global environment, and people everywhere watch what's happening in other countries.
And
they're beginning to see people's power. It doesn't have to be a revolution, but they will not stand down and be subjugated and take no for an answer. They will fight for their freedom. They will move their country forward.
There is an element there, but it's not the whole picture.
Not the whole picture.
It's not the whole picture.
Yes,
and I'm sure also pressure coming from the outside world is also important. People take heart when they know that they're being backed by the international community, that this is right. But the idea of freedom and democracy is not new to humanity. And for George Bush to imply that he has actually invented it is rather ridiculous, especially when it comes to the Middle East.
Just to remind Thomas that a few years ago when Mohammad Khatami was elected as Prime Minister in Iran, we all sat around this table in various different combinations talking about the springtime that was blowing through Tehran, and he'll be stepping down, I think, in May also. And, you know, the theocracy is still in place. The demonstrations of students of 2 and 3 years ago have come, and we've all been excited by them. They've gone by the board. So you have to be very, very cautious.
Totally different.
It is, of course, that's what I think. You cannot make generalizations. The only generalization I think you can make is that you have to be exceptionally cautious when people are given the space to demonstrate. You have to be very cautious in how you read into those demonstrations. It's the only generalization that counts in the Middle East. Every country, I think, is actually quite particular. Rather than, and one of the disasters of the Middle East has been the idea of pan-Arabism, right? But no, the countries are different, and Arabs in one country are different than Arabs in another country.
We remember what happened in Prague. We remember what happened in Berlin. We remember what happened in Ukraine just before Christmas. Who are these people now on the streets in the center of Beirut night after night around Hariri's tomb?
These are the ordinary people of Lebanon, as I said, from all walks of life, and that's what makes it interesting. You never saw really high-class rich people taking to the streets, if you like. They always sat at home and watched on the TV screens or heard from friends or whatever. These are the core, the hardcore of Lebanon. And what is interesting here is everybody agrees on implementing the Taif agreement, meaning everybody wants the Syrian troops out. There is no disagreement on that. I think the hard part begins now when we start talking about issues when implying Hezbollah and also the Palestinian presence in Lebanon. We have something like 300,000 Palestinians in Lebanon. We want these people to be allowed to go back to their country. We want to have a Lebanon for the Lebanese, not for anybody else.
But can I ask you, is this becoming a classic case like in Eastern Europe? And we've seen the suicide, apparently, of a senior officer and former minister in Kiev, for example, in the last couple of days. A classic case like in Eastern Europe of one wild, ill-conceived, arrogant act suddenly leading to the collapse of an authoritarian system. Is this therefore leading to a certain degree of panic in Damascus?
Well, we didn't see a panicky President Bashar yesterday delivering his speech. Quite the contrary, he was throwing jokes, but this does not mean that there is no panic. This does not mean that everybody is feeling great about what's happening. Syria is more or less put in a corner in a way to deliver. And I think yesterday Bashar al-Assad delivered to a great extent. I tell you something else which I did not mention before. I think the Lebanese also want Israel out of Lebanon. And this maybe will come only discuss Hezbollah. Because if Israel is out of Lebanon, of the Sheba farms, which are Lebanese, it means then you can go to Hezbollah and say you don't need the arms to fight Israel. So the situation is rather larger than Syria.
The word panic, I think, is operative because it leads us immediately into the next subject, which is Northern Ireland and Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin are also panicking because they have seen that people will not take it anymore to be under the boot of a private army in the background that overshadows the democratic process.
I thought the conversation was heading exactly the same way. We were moving.
There, but not quite there. You're slightly ahead of me. But keep drawing the analogy there.
Yeah, I think indeed this is a very similar situation. People power in Northern Ireland means that you are beginning finally to break through the omerta, which is this regime of silence.
It's not as serious, but it is serious, and the issue is the same. We've had this terrible murder of Robert McCartney.
Yes. Okay, can I just park that for the moment, Michael, because otherwise we're going to move on. It's complicated enough trying to take apart what's happening in the Middle East. But on this issue of panic and people who've institutionally always had their power from the security services and the Ba'ath Party.
They want to stick to their power, definitely.
So how much are they going to kick, given what we saw in Eastern Europe? Michael, do you have a view?
Well, you know, the Ba'ath Party in Syria, it seems to me, is in a much better condition than the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was, 24 hours before the bombs were unleashed on Saddam. One doesn't read of, a society that's completely crumbled away. And the other thing is that the Ba'ath Party in Syria maintains relations with other countries, and in fact, even with the United States, because we were reading this last week in America of this extraordinary situation where a Canadian Muslim arrested at the request of the United States was in this new hideous bureaucraty's extraordinary rendition. He was sent to Syria. He was actually sent to Syria to be interrogated. So it does mean that somewhere along the line, the back channels, they did get him back. But somewhere along the back channels in Washington, there's contact with Syria, which didn't exist under
Washington
Saddam.
really picks a fight with
Bashar Assad yesterday Bashar Assad referred to the Europeans as our friends. So there is some very good channels between the Syrians and the Europeans. And also, don't forget, when you corner a regime and the people are scared and under threat, that maybe at some point Mr. Bush might think of bombarding Syria. Then, exactly. I know, I agree with you. I totally, but there is this view that it means the people are going to rally around the leadership.
Michael, you're an ex-Washington correspondent. Can you imagine that kind of scenario opening up, even with all the heavy overcommitment in Iraq at the moment?
No, not at all. I think it's okay to play hard cop, soft cop. The Europeans are the soft cop, the Americans the hard cop, and see what you get with these difficult regimes, Syria and Iran. But when I was in Washington in the 80s, one thing Washington never did was pick a fight with Damascus. When in doubt, blame Libya. Blame Gaddafi was always the rule.
But he's now
on side. I agree, they're running out of people to blame. I grant you that. But Iran will do as a whipping boy. I think they'll be more careful with the Syrians.
All right. Your perspective then, Michael, what kind of revolution do you think we are seeing? It's easy to say cedar revolution, orange revolution, velvet revolution, but each revolution has its own kind of complexion.
I've listened with interest to the colleagues. I think we have to be very cautious, and if we're a little optimistic that things are looking brighter, Middle East peace process, bit of movement there too, with any luck, touch wood, but your Mike is entitled to say we've been here before, let's be cautious, and let's hope that we're getting movement. Haven't even mentioned Egypt yet. That's at least as fascinating change there. Wonderful.
Well, we can still talk about it before we go to Sinn Féin, and I'll come back to you in a moment. What kind of revolution? Is it a revolution, or is it something which is naturally taking its own momentum after a dreadful incident only 3 weeks ago tomorrow?
Well, exactly. I mean, in Washington this last week, it's all been about the winds of change unleashed by overthrowing Saddam, but I don't think the winds of change included assassinating Rafik Hariri. So it is a discrete case. And in the case of Egypt, it's very nice to read about, but, unless we're going to also read that the Muslim Brotherhood is allowed to field candidates, it's not really going to be a
well, let's move on to Egypt maybe another week.
He's hard to please.
He's Tom.
Think softly, Nick. Please think softly in that
given what happened in Berlin, and you remember those incidents in East Berlin in those weeks before the wall finally fell and people were leaving the country country pretty liberally. Do you sense the same as in Berlin in 1989?
I would be careful to draw that parallel. My parallel is Iraq, actually. Iraq is a country that everyone watches with horror, increasing horror, and nobody in the Arab world or anywhere else would like another Iraq to happen. And this act of atrocity, this murder of the Lebanese president, created the impression that, good Lord, Lebanon's going down the drain. They're going to create another haven for suicide bombers or other perpetrators. And they will not allow this to happen.
No.
And if Syria stands in the way, something's going to have to give, and Syria will be the loser. So I think Iraq is a deterrent to everyone who's of a rational mind in the Arab world to think, no, wait, one Iraq is quite enough. We're not going to let this happen.
Was it Wally Jumblatt who compared the Iraqi elections to the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Yeah.
I don't remember him. Well, he always comes up with these very interesting quotations.
It's a bit like Ken Livingstone, he comes up with colourful phrases.
I want to move on to Ireland and Sinn Féin in a moment, but what kind of thing do you believe is now going on there? And is it the end of an authoritarian rule?
In Lebanon?
Yeah.
I think so, and I hope so. And all indications point towards that way, and people are extremely optimistic, and I think Syria's president yesterday showed an openness which promises some optimism, to be honest with you. I really think you cannot go backward on the situation in Lebanon, and I do believe that the elections, the coming elections in May are extremely important, who runs and how the election is conducted. And I think Condoleezza Rice spoke here in a meeting that they are even ready to send observers, and they are even ready to send more troops to the south of Lebanon to secure the borders. Israel is an important component on what goes on in Lebanon.
All this after
a
big meeting in London this week, where at least things were moving forward on the Palestinians. In the last few minutes left, let's now move on to Sinn Féin, and I'm not going to go back over the case of Robert McCartney and the £26 million bank robbery, but let me just re-quote what Gerry Adams said at the 100th centenary anniversary meeting in Dublin yesterday. I'm not letting this go until those who have sullied the name of the Republican cause are made to account for their actions. Michael, is this Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, saying, we're in charge, we're now going to respect the law?
I think that this is Gerry Adams, the Republican president, the president of Sinn Féin, who until very recently was one of the most popular politicians in Ireland, both sides of the border, looking at his hemorrhaging popularity and realizing that he has to actually now finally take a very firm stand against what is not a recent phenomenon, the mafiaization of the paramilitary movements, both sides, both sectarian sides. It's something that's been going on since the late 80s. They finance themselves through thuggery, and now that we're in a new era, and the IRA is largely irrelevant, they have become a proper criminal organization, and he has to, if he's going to get to the point that he wants to get to as a political thinker, which is to make Sinn Féin the largest party on the island of Ireland, representing broadly a socialist tradition. He's going to have to step away from the IRA, and he's not an unskilled politician. Witness inviting the sisters of the murdered man. I mean, only Tony Blair would have the chutzpah, the sheer chutzpah, to take people who've created a furore and then put them right next to him on the dais.
Is this a major test, Michael, of the political skills now of Adams and McGuinness, a test of whether they still have the army mentality, or this is now solely about a political process?
I think they've exploited creative ambiguity for a long time. I agree with Mike that Adams has got to distance himself. Sinn Féin's vote hasn't gone down in the last few weeks. It's actually Adams personally. Very skilled political
Has this shifted it, though, in his direction, in terms of his credibility and his standing? What happened yesterday in Dublin?
Very much. Well, he was trying to dig himself out of a hole. Don't forget, he wants to go to the White House for St. Patrick's Day on March the 17th, and he won't get a ticket. And that's important to him, too. So I think Adams is trying to turn Sinn Féin. But Sinn Féin IRA is full of ambiguity. Mike talks about them being a socialist party. Ireland, a deeply conservative country. I don't think many IRA men would describe themselves as socialists, whether they're robbing banks or not. So it's very difficult. Adams is a very, very skillful politician. But when he says got them as far as they've got towards the political process, away from the guns, without exercising great authority and skill.
My question at the start of the programme, those responsible, and there's no way out of this, and I'm quoting Adams here, should admit to what they did in a court of law. Is that an order to them to turn up in a court of law?
Well, they won't obey it.
Okay, Tom.
But I think that statement coming from him is as close as a revolutionary statement you get. We've talked about revolutionary movements in the world. For the Sinn Féin president to come forward may mean that he's frightened to death, losing support and so forth. That's all very tactical. But I think he's made a strategic decision. You've got to cut your losses. In this world of ours, nobody's going to stand for this kind of behavior, this kind of perpetration that happened on the 30th of January. And worse than this actual murder is the surrounding details of it. Those perpetrators cleared the pub. They dismantled the CCTV cameras. They removed all the forensic traces, which seems to suggest in their hubris, they thought, we are the law. We determine what happens here.
Can Adams afford a split? That's the point. Can he break the old IRA? I rather doubt it.
To side with the people, with the people's movement, with the voices in the street, to say, I agree with you, this regime of silence, the omerta, the mafia kind of style of intimidation.
You should make your choices clear.
That's the revolutionary aspect of it, Tom, is that they have played their card about embracing a new police service, acknowledging that the justice system, the British justice system in Northern Ireland will treat them fairly. And in one enormous speech, he says, you go to a court of law. This is where it needs to be determined. And that is quite revolutionary. And as for splits, Michael, I mean, look, the real IRA split and blew up the centre of Omagh, and it completely discredited that kind of splintering.
Just quickly, I think if you make your choice peace, then you don't rob and you don't kill. So once you've made a choice, you should stick to it. Otherwise, I think you're going to lose the confidence of the people.
And can he convince them, do you think, to turn up in court, to submit and answer questions?
And I think if what Michael says they are not going to oblige, then I think he's not credible.
All right. Finally, let's just lighten the mood at the end of the programme, if we can. What seems to have become our Prince Charles moment each week. A month before the wedding, and without Camilla, he's now in New Zealand after a week in Australia, when few Aussies seem to have any interest in the presence of their likely future king. There was, though, far more interest in Mary Donaldson, who became a royal after meeting Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark in a bar at the Sydney Olympics, and then married him. And back home, the Registrar General here says there are 9 legal challenges to the wedding already. Now, Thomas, you've actually interviewed Father Paul Williamson, who's one of the 9.
A great education.
Why is he doing it?
Well, he is Church of England, he's a patriot, he's a royalist, and he thinks this wedding demeans both the royalty, the monarchy, and the relationship between the monarchy and the people. They are serial adulterers, as it were. They undermined each other's previous marriage. We don't want them to be the royal couple par excellence, to stand at the pinnacle of the British institution. It goes against our identity, our sense of identity. It's also against the law, because precedent, 4 cases he quotes in his reason for objections, Edward VIII, the Earl of Harwood, Princess Margaret and Princess Anne, all show that the interpretation of common law is quite clear. Royalty cannot marriage in a civil cause. And interestingly, Lord Falconer now quotes the Human Rights Act and saying under the Human Rights Act it is legal. And then Prince Charles was against that Human Rights Act 2 years ago.
This priest is a former barrister.
He's a former barrister. He was trained, and he fought 44 cases in court. He won against the Queen's Counsel. He's a very suave and enlightened mind about legal matters. He puts morality on the second place and says the illegality of it is not going to come through.
All right, well, quickly, Michael.
Sounds a bit like the Iraq War, doesn't it? Interesting, the Human Rights Act invoked, because that will override most of these objections. Yes. I read in today's papers the British government has offered a small one-clause bill clearing up any doubt with regard to the 1836 Royal Weddings Act. We don't want to go there.
We went there last week,
the Queen
actually.
doesn't want it because she thinks, as well as people like Tom's friends causing trouble, the Republican side of the argument will come in and cause trouble. They don't want to know. It's proving a disaster for poor Charlie. He never gets things right.
All right, quickly.
I want to say something. I'm happy for them. They're in love, and I really admire this great love.
Do you think they're enjoying this, though?
No, I don't think they are, but I think they should be left alone. I like the loyalty that Prince Charles has portrayed here. It's a very good lesson for all of you men around here and around the world. And why not? Let them enjoy it. Let
Michael.
My hard and fast rule is that when the prince is on the other side of the world and south of the equator, I don't think of him at all. So I have nothing to say on it this week.
But he's coming back. He's coming back.
He will, won't he? I know.
Well, thank you to you all, and the message to all of us men. Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We have some lovely Lebanese sweets here to remind us of life in Beirut. From me, Nick Gowing, and all of the guests and team, thanks for joining us. Dateline London, back with Gavin Esler at the same time in the studio next week. Until then, from all of us, bye-bye.
Hello again. We're going to pay for the sunny skies that many of us had during Sunday with some pretty low temperatures, down as low as -5 in a few spots across England and Wales, so a pretty chilly old night. But the week ahead in general should be rather milder than we've been used to over the last couple of weeks, but a lot of cloud around, but many of us, I think, managing to stay dry for most of the time. And that's the story for Monday, really. There will be some sunny spells to start with, less so as the day goes on, as that cloud tends to increase, and every now and again it'll be thick enough to give the odd shower. Might be the odd sharp shower, in fact, across Northern Ireland come the afternoon. And temperatures, well, still nothing too impressive, really. 7 to 9 degrees typically. If you're in the sunshine, not feeling too bad. Under cloudier skies in that breeze, it will still feel quite chilly. Tuesday doesn't look very different. Still rather cloudy, still mostly dry, and still temperatures, well, 7 to 10 degrees.